Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan, and today we're going to be talking about an important effort in Connecticut to protect tenants from being displaced from an unforgiving evictions process that threatens thousands of households across the state. Now, like many states, Connecticut is currently operating under a state eviction moratorium and a federal eviction moratorium. So that means renters who have fallen behind on rent during the pandemic are to some extent protected, at least for the time being, but these protections are set to expire. The Connecticut state moratorium is set to expire in May, and the federal moratorium is set to expire in June. And so when this happens, landlords will be able to evict people at full speed, which will leave many people who have been treading water during this pandemic at immediate risk of losing their homes. And so it's worth noting that these moratoriums haven't even protected everyone from being evicted in Connecticut. More than 1,000 people have already been removed from their homes since October. And according to data reviewed by the appeal, over half of the eviction cases filed in Connecticut during the pandemic last year have been against people who are Black or Latinx, even though these groups make up less than a quarter of the state's population. And so with those numbers set to get much worse, lawmakers in Connecticut are currently considering a variety of measures to soften the blow for tenants. One of the most important is state legislation that would provide renters a right to counsel in eviction proceedings. Now, if you have been tuning into our show, you know all about right to counsel, but even if you haven't, you've probably heard it multiple times before in the criminal court context. You've heard, on the TV shows where they say you have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. But that right does not exist in evictions because evictions take place in civil court. And as a result, the vast majority of tenants facing eviction are forced to fight in court on their own, often against well-resourced landlords with their own lawyers. And so unsurprisingly, this results in some terrible outcomes for tenants. Tenants who fight in eviction court without lawyers are far more likely to lose their homes, to be forced out in evictions carried out by sheriff's deputies. They're also less likely to be able to negotiate move-out dates, to keep evictions off their records, to find rental or relocation assistance, or apply for public housing. And all of these things prevent their ability to find future housing in the future. And so while implementing a right to counsel wouldn't necessarily halt the upcoming wave of evictions, it would at least provide tenants with some level of protection whenever this expiration hits. And so some advocates in Connecticut say that it is really the least that officials could do. They also aren't just sitting around and waiting for legislation to pass. They're also working on the ground right now to help people stay in their homes. And so joining me now to talk about Connecticut's push for a right to counsel and the fight to protect tenants from the forthcoming evictions crisis are Justin Farmer, a member of the Hampden Legislative Council and Central Connecticut chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America, and Dr. Vanessa Lyles, co-project director at PT Partners, a grassroots community organizing nonprofit based in Bridgeport. Thank you both so much for being here. It's really a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So Justin, I'm going to start with you. I'm hoping you can start by filling us in on the scope of the problem in Connecticut. So talk to us about what the landscape looks like right now in terms of evictions. I know I mentioned at the top that a lot of people are being evicted despite the fact that there are these moratoriums. So talk to us about who's being evicted right now and how is that problem going to get worse whenever the protections that do exist expire?
Yeah, that is a great question. So at the beginning of the pandemic, there was estimates that as many as 100,000 people could be evicted in the state of Connecticut. And for a Connecticut context, we have 3 million people. Our largest city is 146,000 people. So when you think about that, that's like a city's worth of people potentially overnight being eligible to be evicted, which would just be a crisis on top of the crisis that we have with affordable housing, our wraparound services like shelters, warming facilities, all would be stretched to their limits. And we're in a better place now, be in terms of COVID, but pre-vaccination, um, it's a global health crisis on top of a local health crisis, in the sense that if you can't keep people isolated and you can't keep them safe, how do you stop the spread of the disease? So where we currently are now, as you mentioned at the top of the segment, most of the people are Black and Latinx. Most of these people are, um, uh, I hate the word, but legally they use indigent. Most of these people are, like my mother was, a single mother with multiple kids, and in really destitute situations. Like, for instance, earlier in the winter, we had a mother being evicted in the middle of a snowstorm in the pandemic, with no place to go.
Mm.
So that's kind of the landscape of where we are in Connecticut.
Mm. So, Doctor, I want to turn to you for a second. Talk to us about how this issue is impacting Bridgeport specifically, and how you are working to address those sorts of challenges that Justin just talked about at the local level.
Oh, in Bridgeport, my work or the work that I do with residents living in low-income public housing is really focused on that population. And we look at that as truly a forgotten population because of the negative stereotype that exists about women, particularly Black women, particularly, and also women of color in general, who generally populate the multifamily units. The stereotype that they are welfare recipients, welfare queens, who are already using the system and abusing the system. So people don't generally think of them as needing protections for that reason. And one of the things that, to talk about how Justin framed the layers that happen, I want to add on a few more layers for people who live in low-income public housing. So in Bridgeport, our public housing authority is in troubled status. That means that it has already been identified by HUD as having multiple issues that prevent it from being a full functioning and fully resourced housing authority. So one of the things that we've identified pre-pandemic is that Bridgeport Housing Authority does not have social services supports in place for residents. So residents were already in trouble in many ways, because when they needed support, when they were in troubled times, there was no support within the housing authority to support them. Then the pandemic comes, and the Bridgeport Housing Authority to now has only sent out a memo that said, make sure you're, of course I'm paraphrasing, but make sure you're hygienic and pay your rent on time. That was the support they received. So in our efforts through our mutual aid, our organization worked with other grassroots organizations and local community partners, and we provided a network, we created a network to make sure residents had support. We were able to get some rental support as well. The problem then continues on, because now you have Unite CT, which is the Treasury Department's support for states to get rental assistance to residents. Our Department of Housing has decided that no Section 8 or public housing residents are eligible for those funds. So now you have a housing authority that provided no support, a Department of Housing that doesn't provide support, yet everyone's still in the pandemic. And around that, the reason, part of the justification for the Department of Housing is that if you live in housing and your rent is, if your income is reduced, your rent is reduced accordingly, because you're only paying at all times 30% of your income. So if you have no income, you pay no rent. The problem also is, with our housing authority, is that their rental recalculations don't happen in real time. So you could owe rent, you could have your income reduced, but in real time, your rent is not reduced. On top of that, you're in a pandemic. On top of that, your cost increased because your children are home. You suddenly realize you need internet service, and not just being able to pick up Wi-Fi from here or there or sharing it with your neighbor. It's not enough. So your costs are increasing like everyone else's. but yet you are not getting the rental assistance. You're not getting any support from you're not getting the support you need from the housing authority. And so as I heard at a housing commissioners meeting, the housing authority is in anticipation of a lifted moratorium so they can proceed with the evictions. And so you have a landlord and a housing authority that is waiting for the moratorium to be lifted so they can proceed with evictions. And this is something that was stated. So we work with a very specific population, and that is where a lot of my focus is, because they are, like I said, a population we don't often think about, and we don't often hear about the multiple oppressions that are coming at them, because these are all interconnected. They're not, housing is not the only oppression that they face.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you mentioned that, because I keep thinking, I'm a former public defender, and most of my focus has been on the criminal legal system prior to working on housing. And something that I keep thinking about when I'm listening to you talk is sort of how, like, all of these sort of punitive systems, evictions, incarceration, are just band-aids for the lack of local governments to address the real problems, which is the fact that our local governments don't do a good job of taking care of people, and particularly taking care of people who are Black and Latinx and who are, to use the same word, indigent. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you what sort of efforts you're organizing around in legislation, other than right to counsel, to advocate for people who may be losing their homes and who are at risk of housing, and for people who sort of need to be taken care of in ways that aren't punitive. Go ahead.
Cool. I'm like, cool. I don't want to just jump in. Well, I think this opens the door to civil Gideons, right? The ability to have people who are first in need have legal representation on the things that matter most to them and that can affect quality of life. In that sense, right to counsel on its own right is really a test run to say, okay, all different facets of life that we talk about, whether it is you're talking about, for instance, we have a trial run with restraining orders and having the right to counsel if you're going through a restraining order process, as sometimes the power dynamics of abuser, abusee, that person doesn't have access to resources to defend themselves. So in that sense, just from the get-go, this has the potentiality to open the floodgates of allowing people first in need to be able to have dignity and respect. In the sense of right to counsel in its own right, something else that we're working really hard on through Central Connecticut DSA is we've been working to get eviction records sealed. There's more opposition to that than right to counsel, which speaks volumes that if a person in good standing had a fall, had a misstep, for whatever reason, is doing well, that for some reason we would hold it against them and say, okay, well, you were evicted 5 years ago, but we're still going to look at that as evidence on whether you're able to hold on to your housing and are a person in good standing in our community. That's antithetical to everything that we talk about what the criminal justice system is supposed to do. That's antithetical to redemption. And the last thing that we're working on, which I'm going to let the good doctor speak a little bit more about, but part of this work started 2 years ago with us knocking in my community. I'm a local city councilor, and 74% of the people in my community are renters. And in that sense, we went door to door where people would say, everything's fine, I don't have any problems. But there was this one man who really stuck out, who was like, I don't have any problems, nothing serious, but my lights aren't working. I've been without hot water for a week. Someone broke into my car. There's not a lock on the back door. A landlord won't fix it. But besides that, everything is fine. And that's when we started to do a lot of work trying to set up tenants unions and try to get people together to advocate for themselves, because the gap that we have at local government, it's really going to take a village mentality of community members coming together, unfortunately, to force us to do what is right.
And the thought that this man thought that this wasn't even a problem just sort of goes to show like how, I don't know, we've all been gaslit in a sense to think that we should sort of accept certain conditions. And anyways, that just struck me. Dr. Lyles, I'll turn to you because Justin kicked it to you. So feel free to go ahead and talk about other efforts that you're pushing.
Yeah, thanks. So just to pick up where he left off with the tenant union. So we have been meeting with other tenants who are looking to organize themselves. Again, we work primarily with residents living in multi-unit low-income public housing. And by default, they have resident councils that are supported through HUD funds. Unfortunately, due to the nature of institutional oppression and how it works systemically, those resident councils can be a part of that. Even with the protections that it has, those resident councils can be suppressed, and they have been in Bridgeport. So as PT partners, we actually do the work that resident councils or unions can also are attempting to do. And residents, again, have the power. People have the power. And part of what we look at is that it is, it's really, people want people to believe that individually that's where your power is as an individual, and you can fight and make change. What we really push forward and tell residents on a day-to-day basis is no, coming together is where your power is. So we work together to help residents understand. And again, when the closures happened, we were in a perfect position to continue with the mutual aid we are providing, and even had been providing, and make it stronger, because we recognized a while back that the needs that residents were having were not one-off here and there. They were needs that required us to work together and look forward and build power. So we continue that, and part of that work doesn't necessarily always go towards directly hit upon a bill that's attempting to pass through the House or the Senate at the state level, but it goes towards it. So such as I mentioned earlier, Unite CT and rental assistance. So we convene a weekly meeting along with other partners in housing on rental assistance for people who are working with people to get rental assistance, and identifying the issues and the challenges of that Department of Housing program. And that's very important, because we do not need the $235 million that's there now needs to get into to the landlord's pockets so that tenants can stay in their apartments or their homes. So, and that's going to be a challenge, because we do not believe that without our push, without our work, that will happen, that $235 million will happen. We also support Clean Slate, very much so, especially working with Connect, which is an organization of different faith bodies, houses throughout Connecticut. And they've been working on this for a number of years, because we've been a part of that push for a number of years. And so it's very important that people have a clean slate, especially people, again, who are at the margins of society, where you would find that the oppressive nature of institutions that we live under are targeting that population and where they're most affected. We also supported racism as a public health crisis. That's going through, that has passed through, if I'm pretty sure it passed through the House, and now it's at the Senate in Connecticut, which is very important so it to be studied, so it can be addressed. And if you look at the Connecticut, the governor's budget that he just proposed, there is a lot of the thread of racism as a public health crisis and racial equity weaved throughout his budget, which I'm very, very happy about. I am not naive in any way to think that that's going to solve a problem, but I do believe that if we put money towards it and name it, explicitly name the racial equity, then there will be some address to it. But we have to continue to push for that. And then also Black maternal health. Again, public housing, mostly women of color, women with children as head of household. So Black maternal health in particular is very important to us. Black Maternal Health Week just happened, and we supported a lot of organizations and making sure that awareness is brought to that, especially at the legislative level. There's funding that's looking to be brought for doulas, and especially Black doulas are really important. And in Bridgeport, we have a great initiative through Bridgeport Prospers for that.
There are so many things to comment on, but I'll let Justin comment first because I feel like you're ready.
Oh no, I'm so happy that you mentioned the doulas. I used to be an intern at Planned Parenthood, so I was following the doula bill last session very carefully. And just to your point again, when we look at the disparities, the people closest to the problem, as my representative Robin Porter often says, are closest to the solution. And we know things like birth doulas, where we're allowing people to pick healthcare providers who share their cultural identity, who have an understanding of the nuance of things that affect their health, can really make sure that they come to term and have healthy babies. And that's, this is all woven in the idea of wraparound services, right? We have an individualistic society where we think we as an individual really through self-determinance, we can solve our issues. But we need people to wrap us, right? We need to be swaddled. Sometimes we need to be held together by others. So thank you for the work you're doing. And I got excited hearing about it.
And I also think it's really important because, some of the studies we've seen have shown that Black women are the most at risk of evictions. And then even more so, that risk is added when there is a child in the home. We've talked a lot on this show about how the impact on the child is huge and long lasting, all sorts of health complications and things of that sort. So that's sort of a perfect example of addressing the problem and not compounding it and not sort of making it worse through all of these sort of punitive and oppressive responses. But something else I also wanted to comment on is you talked about how a lot of this rental relief is not getting to landlords. Do you see that this is partially because landlords are refusing it so that they can continue through the eviction process anyways?
Go ahead, Justin.
So this is part of the problem that we have, right? This is part of a housing crisis, and we see things like gentrification. We see landlords who see this as an opportunity to raise their rates. So you have some landlords who have no intention on keeping their tenants. And in some cases, when you look at these private equity firms who just have housing conglomerates, they don't actually make their money off of rent. They make their money off of real estate and holding that real estate. So to them, rent is just a sweetener. And in that sense, they really don't care about the people who are living there. Any excuse to evict them, they are more than happy to. I would like to believe that there's more landlords who are working in good faith. But, we can't just work on hope and prayers. And in that sense, I think that's where a lot of advocates are very frustrated on the process, that we're putting it more in the ball court of the landlords rather than the tenants who, this decision of whether the landlords get the money or not determines whether they have grounds to stay in their homes or if they're out on the streets.
Doctor, I don't know if you wanted to jump in here.
Well, I do know that with Unite CT, it does not show that overwhelmingly rent landlords are not accepting the funds or doing their part, because both parties, the renter and the landlord, has to complete paperwork. And there is a component though that does deter some landlords, and not that it's a bad thing, but there's a 15% forgiveness that is expected if you accept the money. So in terms of your arrears, if you are owed funds, I mean, if back funds are owed to you, that are not covered by the potentially $10,000 that a renter can get in rental assistance, then that landlord, in order to accept those funds, have to forgive about 15% of that. And so, yeah, we're not finding that landlords by and large aren't, but we also know that the funds, it opened up in March, around March 15th, that the vast majority of funds have not been approved for applicants. So the money has to be committed by September 30th, I believe, and all of it gone by the end of December. So we're just a little concerned that will happen, because this process relies solely on digital support. You can call a call center, but you need to be comfortable with doing a complete application, uploading documents, understanding the glitches. If you don't, put in the correct information, it won't go through, but it won't tell you why it won't go through. So you're not really aware. So if you're not comfortable filling out online applications in whole, then it's a very cumbersome process, and it does require that you get some support. And we're trying on the ground level to really work with residents and tenants to fill out this application, but it's a very frustrating process.
So, okay, I want to switch to some of the opposition, and sort of hear both of your takes on how you respond to different pieces of opposition. So the first, I just want to hear from both of you, and I'll start with you, Doctor, about sort of what sort of opposition you're hearing. I know that despite the fact that this is something that right to counsel is something that's so common sense, there are folks who are sort of intent on keeping the status quo across the country, really. So curious to hear what you've heard from that opposition and how they've managed to keep that status quo up until now.
I'm not too focused on the opposition because it's not something that comes to me so clearly, which is good. But at the same time, what I've heard is that it's not organized opposition, I guess it was what I'm trying to say, but in an anecdotal way, and things that people say are that, again, people are getting support, you're getting rental assistance, why do you need this measure? It takes a very sympathetic look at the landlord, as though the landlord will somehow be adversely or unfairly affected by someone else having counsel, even though they are highly likely or definite to bring in counsel themselves. It is seen as though the tenant is given some type of extra support that is unneeded. And it also looks at the person who hasn't been paying rent as a definite, that the reason they aren't paying the rent is because they are being negligent themselves. So why should that be rewarded? And so those are some of the things that I'm hearing, which is, again, based on what people believe about what they think poor people are and who they think poor people are, and that they're not deserving, and that they're not the same as people who pull themselves up by their bootstraps and work hard like a person who owns a piece of property. It's the narratives that haven't changed.
I actually want to read a quote of one narrative where I was reading a recent report about evictions in Connecticut. There was John Souza, who's the leader of the Connecticut Property Owners Association, who said of the extended moratorium that, quote, "At this point, they're only protecting the bad people. This is purely political. There's no other reason. Our economy is mostly open. Is there anything that's not open anymore? To some degree, everything's open. It's not like you can't find an apartment or a job." I'm wondering what your response is to that.
Again, it is based on someone whose interests they're looking to preserve for themselves. And as well, that this person clearly understands that there is a stereotype, a trope of the poor person, of the like I said, the people who take advantage of the system, the people who get too much, the people who aren't working hard, and knows that they're able to capitalize on that and then use it to, again, not speak to why they're evicting people who have needs, but speak more to the character of the people who are looking for support and looking for to keep a roof over their head in a home. So to me, it's, I don't know, it's very typical. It's nothing I haven't heard before that happens. That's said every day in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Justin, I see you nodding, so feel free to pop in here, talk about the opposition, respond.
Yeah, I'm the youngest of five. My mother immigrated from Jamaica. We manage our rental property. There's this idea about the mom and pop landlord. There's not many of us, right? Uh, well, we are in a position to rent to people who are very similar to my family before we got that opportunity to be in safe, affordable, clean housing. Something that I never had to really face, but was a constant concern mentally, emotionally, financially to my family to chase opportunities. When I hear individuals speak like that, um, these are poverty pimps, right? They make money off of poverty. They have no interest in solving the issues. They are fine with capitalizing off of exploiting people. Um, when we gave testimony, there was one gentleman who decided to listen to testimonies of us talking about right to counsel, who was a landlord who owned several properties. Uh, Heard an individual talk about how they do mutual aid, looked up that person's name, found their number by calling other people part of the mutual aid uh, collective, and then got that person's number individually and yelled at them about why right to counsel was bad. That is what I call a bad faith actor. Um, if you have the time to sit through a public hearing all day, which many of us did, but it was to the detriment of our paychecks, detriment of our time. But if you are in a position of power where you can do that and then berate individuals for advocating for themselves, I'm not sure if you want a solution. But in terms of opposition, I hear about cost. When we know right to counsel can save, give us 2 to 1, or in some cases 12 to 1 in investment return. When we're talking about wraparound services, when we're talking about warming shelters, my community, it's extra $30,000 for 6 weeks to have a warming shelter. This year, the warming shelter was across the street from my house in an old factory where jobs left my community. And I had to watch 50 people line up for 25 spaces so that they can sleep on the floor, so that they wouldn't freeze out in the cold. So when I hear these arguments, one, it's not cost effective. Two, it's not dealing with the public health crisis that we have or the quality of life. When you have individuals peeing outside, when you have individuals congregating in such a way that's a public health issue. But most importantly, the argument that I often hear is about these mom and pop landlords, to which my argument back is that the law is blind, right? It's supposed to bring equilibrium. It's supposed to bring everybody to equal footing. So I've had horrible tenants, right? I've had people who are like, cool, I'm gonna fight you because I'm mad. And there's so many other stuff going on. And sometimes they can't articulate, these are the other issues I'm having. But to have a lawyer, to have someone negotiate out some of those things, maybe that tenant has to leave, but maybe instead of giving them 3 days, maybe they get 3 months. Maybe they work out a payment plan. Maybe it's a horrible landlord. No one likes to talk about industrial slum landlords, but if you got broken pipes and you got infestations, why should I pay you my hard-earned money to live in subpar conditions? Because I'm poor? I don't deserve basic quality of life. So when I hear these arguments, I don't hear people who are looking for solutions. I'm hearing people who are making excuses on why this housing crisis is adequate. Um, and as a lawmaker, I want to come up with solutions. I don't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. I want everybody to be able to make money and live well. But when we have more and more people sinking into these destitute situations that bring down the quality of life, that bring down communities first in need, that allow for gentrification, that allow for displacement of people, I'm not sure if they actually want to be in community with me. So I get frustrated when I hear these conversations.
We do have to wrap up in a bit, but I do want to ask one final question, which is what needs to happen for right to counsel to get passed? Where is it in the legislature right now? What are the next steps?
So far, the governor recently put in to his stimulus bill $10 million for the right to counsel. So we are very excited about that. Now it has to go to the House floor and the Senate floor. We're comfortable with the numbers in the Senate. So right now it's more advocating in the House to call the bill and to do it sooner rather than later. But very exciting stuff.
Well, thank you both so much for being here today. And it's really been a pleasure speaking with you both, and keep on fighting the good fight.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. So a few sort of takeaways from this particular segment, which is the first is sort of how deep this crisis is. I think the words that were used was that there's a city worth of people who will be facing eviction, and that we're facing a crisis on top of a crisis. We have the global pandemic, and then on top of that, the forcing of people to leave their homes into unsafe conditions, which is not only something that is devastating for families and for individual households, but also devastating for the public health state of emergency at large. And something that is particularly worth noting here is that a right to counsel is a very simple solution to making this process better and improving people's lives, improving the state of this pandemic. It's something that's supported by the public, and it's also something that saves money. So for example, there's actually data to back this up. So a recent poll by Data for Progress and the Lab, which is a project of the appeal, found that 67% of Connecticut voters, including 51% of Republicans, would support a statewide right to counsel in eviction proceedings. And we also, academic studies of right to counsel programs have also shown that they pay for themselves. Cities spend less money to provide low-income tenants with lawyers than they do for the costs associating with caring for people after the fact if they lose their homes. And that's a really important thing to note, because I think something that we talked a lot about today in this interview was sort of how, local governments have failed to provide all these things for people, right? And we know that doing that, providing safe housing for people, providing a right to counsel, would not only be better for communities that have been ignored for so many years, but also would simply save money. So it will be interesting to see the next steps in Connecticut to see if this is something, this common sense measure is something that is successful and reaches its way to passage. And we will be watching closely as that happens. So thank you so much for joining us today on The Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news.